This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Hannah Williams had always been the quiet one in the family. At 12 years old, she was the youngest of 3 children, but she had always felt like the outsider in her own home. Her older brother Ethan was the golden child, the charming, athletic teen who could do no wrong. He was popular at school, always surrounded by friends, always the first to speak up at the dinner table, the first to get attention. Her older sister Amanda was the typical teenage rebel, the one who fought with their parents constantly, but despite her anger and attitude, she had the ability to command a room when she walked into it. Hannah, by contrast, never knew how to assert herself. She didn't have Ethan's confidence, nor Amanda's rebellious spirit. She was just there, always in the background, always silent, always unnoticed. Her mother, Grace, often spoke about her like she was some sort of delicate flower, fragile, shy, and in need of constant protection. Grace would go on and on about how sensitive Hannah was, as though it were some kind of flaw. Grace didn't understand the darkness inside her daughter, the way Hannah would sometimes stare at the world with hollow eyes, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Hannah's father, Daniel, was a man of few words, a successful lawyer who worked long hours and often came home late, too tired to pay attention to anything but his own exhaustion. He never took the time to ask his children how they were feeling. He didn't know about Hannah's nightly rituals of slipping into her room after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting on her windowsill, staring out into the empty night, imagining what it would feel like to disappear, to make them all notice her for once. For years, Hannah had kept her feelings hidden. She absorbed the constant verbal jabs from her siblings, the overbearing concern from her mother, the cold indifference from her father. She was used to it, used to being invisible, used to the lack of attention. But the truth was, no one ever asked what was really going on inside her. No one ever took the time to notice the signs, the way her eyes would flicker with something darker whenever someone mentioned the word family or togetherness. It wasn't that she wanted to be loved, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something more visceral. Hannah wanted to be seen for who she was, to be acknowledged for the pain she carried inside her chest, the weight of being ignored, the rage that simmered just below the surface. And yet, every time she tried to show it, every time she felt the urge to speak out, the words got stuck in her throat. They were buried under layers of silence, layers that had been built over the years like the walls of a fortress, protecting her from the world she could never quite fit into. Her parents, especially Grace, would have called her shy, introverted, maybe even anxious, but Hannah knew the truth. She wasn't shy. She wasn't anxious. She was angry. Angry at the way her family treated her, angry at how they never took the time to understand who she really was, angry at how they never listened. And the longer she stayed silent, the more that anger grew, festered, coiled up like a snake inside her chest. It was always there, waiting, watching. It whispered to her during quiet moments, in the stillness of the night when the house was asleep, telling her that everything would be different if they just noticed her, if they just saw her. She didn't want their sympathy or their pity, she wanted their acknowledgement, their respect. But most of all, she wanted them to feel the weight of her silence, to feel the suffocating presence of someone who had been left behind, who had been forgotten. At school, things were no better. Hannah's classmates barely knew she existed. She sat in the back of the room, never raising her hand, never making eye contact with anyone. It wasn't that she was unpopular, she wasn't. She just didn't care. She didn't want to be part of their world. There were times when she would sit alone at lunch, watching the other kids talk and laugh, and she would wonder if she would ever find a way out of this cycle. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. It felt like there was no escape, and when she went home, it was just the same. The same cold house, the same cold people, the same empty silences. Her family never suspected a thing. They didn't know what Hannah was capable of, what she had planned in the deep recesses of her mind, those twisted fantasies that began to take shape in the late hours of the night. They never knew about the anger that gnawed at her insides, about the long, secret conversations she had with herself, conversations about what it would take to make everything stop. They didn't know about the daydreams where she imagined herself standing in the middle of the house, holding something sharp, making them finally look at her, finally notice her. It wasn't just about hurting them, it was about power. It was about control, about showing them that she could make them feel something, anything. She could make them see her. The idea of a family trip came about out of nowhere. Grace had planned it as a way to reconnect, as a way to bond. They were going to Arizona for a week, staying at a secluded cabin in the middle of the desert. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a break from the routine. Grace was always trying to fix things, always trying to make everything perfect. But Hannah couldn't see it that way. A trip, A trip wouldn't fix what had been broken for so long. A trip wouldn't change the way her family treated her, the way they overlooked her. No, the trip was just another excuse for them to ignore her, to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. The desert cabin might as well have been a prison to her. Just another place where she would be invisible. Just another place where her feelings would be ignored. On the second day of the trip, Hannah began to feel the familiar pull of rage, of resentment, of the suffocating weight of her own silence. The desert outside was vast and empty, just like she felt inside. And as she watched the sun set over the barren landscape, the anger inside her began to build once more. It was as if the silence of the desert mirrored the silence she had lived with her entire life. And in that silence, she finally found clarity. Her family wasn't going to fix themselves. They weren't going to listen to her. They weren't going to change. But maybe, just maybe, she could change everything. She could finally make them see her. The thought took root slowly at first. It crept in quietly, like a snake slithering through the cracks of her mind. It was simple. She could make them feel what she had felt all these years. She could make them notice her, make them realize just how much they had neglected her. But it wasn't just about getting attention, it was about power. She had spent so long being overlooked, being ignored, that the thought of taking control, of having the power to make them all stop and listen, felt intoxicating. The anger that had been building for so long began to feel like something she could use. And in that moment, Hannah Williams made a decision, one that would change everything. In the heart of the Arizona desert, with nothing but the vast expanse of sand and rock around her, Hannah knew what she had to do. Her family would never see her, not unless she made them. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She wasn't going to be invisible. This time she would make them notice her. And when they did, it would be too late. The Arizona desert had always been a place of extremes, its beauty both terrifying and mesmerizing. To most people, it was a sprawling sea of endless sand dunes, jagged red rock formations, and vast open skies. A place where the sun beat down mercilessly by day, and the cold, unforgiving winds whispered haunting songs through the canyon walls at night. But to Hannah Williams, the desert felt like a vast, empty void, a perfect backdrop for the darkness growing inside her. Her family had chosen the isolated desert getaway as the location for their annual vacation, a week-long retreat meant to bring them closer together. But for Hannah, it felt less like a bonding experience and more like a prison. The house, nestled deep in the heart of the Arizona wilderness, was a sprawling modern cabin that stood out against the raw beauty of its surroundings. The exterior was made of rough-hewn stone, its surfaces weathered by years of sun and wind, giving it a hardened, almost unnatural appearance in the stark desert landscape. It had large windows that seemed to open up to the infinite stretches of dry earth and sharp cacti, but to Hannah they only served as a reminder of her isolation, of the emptiness around her, of the suffocating silence that seemed to grow deeper every day. The cabin was far from any town or village, its closest neighbor miles away, hidden beneath the haze of the shimmering heat that radiated from the earth. The nearest gas station was a 2-hour drive, and even the nearest park ranger station was unreachable, unless you knew the hidden back roads. It wasn't the sort of place where you could just walk out for a stroll or call a cab when you needed to get away. The isolation was absolute, the silence as thick as the dry desert air. The house was perched on a small hill, overlooking a wide expanse of cracked earth and boulder-strewn terrain. The landscape around it was harsh and unforgiving, the kind of environment where life had learned to survive by hardening itself against the elements. Tall, gnarled cacti dotted the land, their arms reaching upward like skeletal fingers, desperate for a touch of the sun. In the distance, jagged mountain ranges framed the horizon, their peaks dusted with the faintest hint of snow, a stark contrast to the scorching heat below. The ground, parched and cracked, seemed like a wound in the earth, left to fester in the open sun. The landscape stretched on in every direction, unbroken and barren, as though the world had forgotten it even existed. The house itself, designed for luxury but oddly out of place, had a modern, almost sterile feel. It was too large for a family of 5, too cold and impersonal to be truly inviting. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new wood and stale air conditioning. It had sleek, polished floors of dark hardwood, and heavy leather furniture arranged in a way that suggested it was meant to impress rather than make anyone feel comfortable. The walls were adorned with modern art that felt too perfect, too devoid of any real personality. The living room was spacious, with high ceilings that stretched up into shadows, making the space feel even emptier, like a cavern. The kitchen was a shiny, pristine area where Grace, her mother, always tried to create warmth and family meals, but the coldness of the house seemed to seep into every dish, every moment of togetherness. It was on the second day of their stay when the oppressive silence of the desert began to sink in deeper. The days were long and uncomfortably hot, the temperature rising into the triple digits before noon, making every inch of the cabin feel like a furnace. Despite the air conditioning inside, the heat outside seemed to creep through the walls like a slow-burning fever, pushing everyone further into their own corners. The landscape beyond the house felt like it was suffocating them all, as though the earth itself was pressing in on them, forcing them to confront the things they'd been avoiding. The emptiness outside mirrored the emptiness inside Hannah, and the stillness of the land mirrored the distance between her and the family she lived with, a family that seemed to be disintegrating under the weight of their own disconnectedness. In the mornings, the family would venture out on short hikes, trying to find something to do to occupy their time, but the scorching heat quickly drove them back indoors. Ethan, the older brother, would drag his feet in mock frustration, his loud voice carrying across the house, complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi or the lack of entertainment. Amanda, the rebellious older sister, would sulk in the corner of the cabin, her headphones in, pretending to ignore everyone. Grace would force smiles, trying to fill the house with cheer, even as her nerves began to fray. And Daniel, the father, would spend most of his time on the phone, handling work calls, trying to prove that he was somehow still connected to the world beyond this suffocating place. But it wasn't the outside that held Hannah's attention, it was the house itself, the desolate land beyond, and the weight of her own growing rage. She would sit in the quiet corners of the cabin, staring out the windows at the barren, unforgiving desert. There was something strange about the place, something that made her feel both unnervingly calm and unsettlingly exposed. The house was like a fortress, but the desert outside was like an open wound, a raw, unprotected expanse that stretched on for miles, offering nothing but space. It was in this empty place that her thoughts began to turn darker. The nights were the worst. The sun would finally dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. The temperature would drop suddenly and the cold desert air would seep into the house, sending chills through the walls. The wind would howl through the cracks, creating a ghostly chorus that rattled the windows. The silence of the day would give way to the strange noises of the desert night, an owl's hoot in the distance, the distant cry of a coyote, or the sound of something scraping against the ground. The isolation was even more apparent at night, as if the whole world had been swallowed by the desert, leaving only the family behind, like insects caught in a glass jar. Hannah would lie in her bed at night, the sheets twisted around her, listening to the wind outside, feeling a strange sense of calm. The desert had a way of making her feel like she was the only one left in the world, as though everything else, the noise, the demands, the expectations, had ceased to exist. In the darkness, she could hear her own thoughts clearly. The oppressive silence outside matched the silence she felt in her heart, the emptiness that had been growing inside her for so long. It was on one of these nights, when the moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim light over the desert, that something inside Hannah snapped. The weight of the silence outside, the crushing indifference of the landscape, and the years of being invisible to her family finally merged. The house, the desert, and everything it represented became a stage for her anger, a stage for her final act. The isolation, both physical and emotional, had allowed her to build a kind of dark clarity, an understanding of the power she could wield in this forgotten place. No one would hear their screams, no one would know what happened. The desert would swallow everything whole, just as it had swallowed her years of silence. She felt free in a way she had never felt before, as if the earth beneath her feet and the sky above her head had given her permission to make a choice that would break the chains of her own life. And so, in the suffocating stillness of the desert night, with the wind howling like a distant wail, Hannah made her decision. The land outside was barren and empty, and so was she. The family she had lived with, the family that had ignored her for so long, would never truly understand her unless she forced them to. The desert would remain silent, but for the first time in her life, Hannah felt like she could make the world listen. The first crack in the glass came quietly, like a whisper. It wasn't the kind of event that announced itself with grandeur, no dramatic confrontation or blazing row. It was a quiet, everyday moment, just like all the others in Hannah Williams' life. But in that moment, something inside her broke. The sharp edge of her anger, which had been simmering for so long, finally found its mark. It had been building for years of being overlooked, ignored, belittled, and it all boiled down to this one simple, seemingly insignificant moment. It was in the kitchen, a place she normally avoided. Her mother had been in there all morning, preparing breakfast, as she always did. Hannah had slipped in quietly, hoping to grab something to eat before her family descended upon the meal like a swarm of locusts, too eager to notice the quiet girl in the corner. Her mother was humming to herself, her back turned to Hannah as she sliced through the ripe fruits for the salad, her movements precise, careful, like she always did. It was a ritual, and it was part of what kept her tethered to the world she thought was perfect, the one where everything was supposed to be neat, clean, organized. Grace Williams had no room for chaos, for mess, for the unpredictability of a child who wasn't living up to the image of what she expected. And for Hannah, her mother's overbearing perfectionism felt like a prison. That morning, Grace had been talking again, prattling on about how they were all so blessed to be on this family trip. "This is exactly what we need," she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Hannah hated that smile. It was the kind of smile that spoke volumes about her mother's constant need to push everything into neat little boxes, like how she would try to force a square peg into a round hole, all because she couldn't stand the messiness of life. "I just think this vacation is so important," Grace said as she turned, holding a plate of fruit slices in her hand. "We're going to reconnect as a family. I really hope you all take this seriously, Hannah. I want you to make the effort, okay?" Hannah froze. The words hit her like a slap across the face, but it wasn't just because her mother had spoken to her like she was some kind of problem to be solved. It was the way she always said things. The way she never really saw her. Never really acknowledged her. It was always about Ethan, always about Amanda, always about the idea of family being perfect and flawless, as if Hannah was just a shadow in the corner of their perfect little picture. The irony hit her like a ton of bricks. The idea of reconnecting as a family was laughable. They weren't reconnecting. They were just pretending to be something they weren't. "I try," Mom Hannah said in a soft voice, but her words were heavy with something darker. Her mother didn't hear it. Grace smiled warmly, but it was forced. "Good. I want to see that." That was the moment when the anger, which had been quietly waiting inside her, began to stir. It started small, a burning sensation in her chest, a tightness in her throat. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way, but it felt different now. More intense, more dangerous. She was tired of it all. Tired of being the quiet one, the invisible one. Tired of watching everyone else get what they wanted while she remained in the background, unnoticed, unheard. Tired of the expectations her family piled on her shoulders, expectations she could never meet. Make the effort, her mother had said. But what about her? What about what she wanted? What about what she needed? She wanted them to see her. To acknowledge her. To stop pretending she was just a side note in their perfect little family narrative. "Mom, I don't think you get it," Hannah murmured under her breath. "What?" Grace asked, her voice bright with false cheer, thinking that Hannah was just being a difficult child. Hannah didn't answer at first. She just stared at the fruit slices in her mother's hand, at the way Grace moved so deliberately, so carefully. It made Hannah sick. She was so perfect, so put together, so untouchable. And yet she was the one who never truly saw her daughter. Her anger seethed in silence, boiling inside of her like a pressure cooker with the lid too tight. She could feel the tears rising behind her eyes, tears she refused to shed, because tears were for the weak, for those who couldn't control their emotions. No, she was beyond that now. She didn't need to cry. She didn't need to beg for attention. She needed something else, something more. Hannah's gaze drifted toward the knife on the counter, a long, thin blade with a gleaming silver edge. It was small enough to be inconspicuous, but sharp enough to cut through anything. It was a simple kitchen knife, one that her mother used every morning to prepare breakfast. And as her eyes lingered on it, something inside her shifted. The sharpness of the knife called to her, like a whisper in the back of her mind, a voice that grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't a voice of reason, nor was it a voice of compassion. It was the voice of something darker, something she had kept buried for so long. It was the voice of rage. She didn't reach for it, not yet, but the thought lingered, pressing against the walls of her mind like a heavy weight. What would happen if she finally acted on that impulse? What if just for once, she took control? What if she made them listen? What if she made them feel? Hannah Grace's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you even paying attention? I want you to try. This trip is about family. It's about bonding." Hannah didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked away, feeling the weight of her mother's gaze pressing against her back. She wasn't trying to be rebellious. She wasn't trying to make a scene. But in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to feign interest. She was done with the charade. Done with pretending that everything was okay. She needed something else now. something far darker. Later that night, as the family gathered around the large wooden table in the cabin's dining room, the same words continued to echo in her mind: make the effort, bond, reconnect. All of it felt so suffocating, so empty. No one noticed how Hannah quietly withdrew from the conversation, how her fingers twisted nervously around the edge of her glass, how her eyes seemed to glaze over as her family continued to chat around her. It was all so ordinary, so meaningless. They talked about trivial things, the weather, the hikes, the food, but no one talked about anything that really mattered. Not the things that lived inside Hannah, not the rage that had been festering for so long, not the suffocating silence that had surrounded her for years. Ethan and Amanda argued, as they always did, about petty things: who had the better room, who got the bigger slice of cake. Their voices blended into a background hum, something familiar and insignificant. Grace smiled, tried to mediate, always the peacemaker, always striving for that perfect image of family harmony. And Daniel, as usual, was absorbed in his own world, his attention divided between his phone and the distant murmur of the conversation. No one noticed Hannah's expression change, the way her face hardened, the way her hands clenched beneath the table. They didn't see the spark of something dangerous flicker in her eyes. And in that moment, as the conversation continued to swirl around her like the wind outside, Hannah made a decision. It wasn't a choice born out of impulse or a sudden urge. It was something that had been building for a long time, a slow burn that had turned into an inferno. Her family would never understand. They would never notice her, not in the way she needed them to. They would never listen. And so, she would make them listen. She would make them see her. She would make them feel. They had pushed her to this point, ignored her for so long. And now, in the emptiness of the desert night, the trigger was pulled. As dusk fell over the Arizona desert, the night air grew thick with the tension that had been silently building throughout the day. The family had retreated to their isolated cabin after a long day of hiking and sightseeing, their laughter echoing in the empty spaces of the house, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The desert, with its unforgiving isolation, seemed to hold its breath, as if it too could feel the imminent danger approaching. Hannah sat at the edge of the table during dinner, barely aware of the conversation swirling around her. Her eyes glazed over as she poked at the food on her plate. Her parents, Daniel and Grace, were engaged in a light-hearted debate over the quality of the steaks they had grilled, while Ethan and Amanda argued about trivial matters: who had the better view from their respective rooms, who had eaten the most of the salad. The usual, empty noise. Hannah's hands, pale and trembling ever so slightly, rested on her lap. Her fingers flexed as if testing the grip she still held on reality. Inside, everything felt like it was coming undone. The resentment had been building for years, an undercurrent of bitterness woven into the fabric of their family life. She had tried so hard to be what they wanted her to be. She tried to fit into the image they had for her, to be the good daughter, the quiet one, the one who didn't make waves. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Her father was always busy, her mother always too perfect to notice her struggles, and her siblings, well, they were too wrapped up in their own worlds to care about the one person who was suffocating in silence. Tonight, though, something was different. There was a crackling energy in the air, a weight pressing down on her chest that she couldn't shake. It was like something in her had snapped, and it wasn't just anger anymore. It was a deep, hollow feeling of abandonment, of being invisible, of being unloved. And the worst part? She knew they'd never understand. They'd never see her for who she truly was. No matter what she did, she'd always remain in the background, a shadow in their perfect little family. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts, sweet and comforting, but hollow in Hannah's ears. "We're lucky to be here together, don't you think?" Grace said, smiling, a forced, shining smile that barely hid the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's important to have these family moments." Hannah looked up from her plate, her gaze cold and distant. "Lucky," she repeated, the word tasting like acid on her tongue. You don't know what lucky is. No one heard her. Or maybe they simply ignored her. It was nothing new. Her father, oblivious as always, smiled and patted her shoulder. "Come on, Hannah, it's not so bad. We're all together. That's what matters. Let's enjoy it." The weight inside her chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. She felt trapped in this family, in this life, in this endless cycle of pretending that everything was fine when it was far from it. It was all just a game to them, wasn't it? A game of smiles and pretend happiness. And in that moment, she realized she didn't want to play anymore. Without thinking, her hand moved under the table. She could feel the cool, smooth edge of the knife that had been left there after the meal, its blade glinting in the low light from the overhead chandelier. It was just a regular kitchen knife, nothing special, nothing to make anyone think twice. But in her hand it felt like the only thing she could control, the only thing that could give her the power she had long been denied. Her heart raced as she gripped it tighter, the pulse in her ears growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't about the knife. Not really. It wasn't even about the anger that burned through her veins like wildfire. It was about finally feeling something, anything. Finally having the courage to stop pretending, to stop living under the suffocating weight of her family's expectations. "I'm done," she whispered to herself, barely audible over the chatter of her family. Her mother's laugh suddenly cut off, a small sound of confusion escaping her lips. She turned to Hannah, her brow furrowed with concern. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Hannah looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Grace's smile faltered, and for a moment, just a moment, Hannah could see the cracks in the mask her mother wore every day. But the illusion was quickly restored as Grace's face brightened once more, like a fresh coat of paint covering up the rot beneath. "What's wrong, dear?" her mother asked, her tone now full of concern. But that too felt fake to Hannah. She didn't want concern. She didn't want pity. She wanted them to see her, to see the real her. Not the version they'd made up in their heads, but the one who had been buried under their perfect little world. "I'm fine," Hannah said quietly, her fingers still clutching the knife. "Just tired." She stood up slowly, almost deliberately. As the conversation continued around her, she felt the eyes of her family on her, but they didn't know. They never would. None of them could ever understand how it felt to be so utterly, completely invisible. She left the room, stepping into the darkness of the hallway. The sounds of the family dinner faded behind her, replaced by the low hum of her thoughts, her heart hammering in her chest. The desert night stretched out before her, silent and vast, just like the emptiness she felt inside. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't care. The further she walked, the clearer the noise in her head became, the more urgent the need to do something, anything about it. Out in the desert, under the stars, Hannah came to a sudden stop. It was as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her, forcing her to make a choice. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about freedom. The freedom that came with finally taking control of her own story, her own fate. No more pretending. No more silence. She turned around and walked back toward the cabin, her footsteps steady and certain. When she stepped back into the house, it was like a switch had been flipped. Her family, oblivious as ever, continued to talk and laugh. But for Hannah, everything had changed. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was the one with the power now. The knife felt heavier in her hand. It wasn't about what happened next, or what she would do with it. It was about the fact that for the first time in years, she was in control. And the terrifying truth was, she didn't know how far she was willing to go to keep that control. The desert air hung heavy with the stench of heat, mixing with the smell of dust and dried grass as the local authorities flooded into the remote cabin site. It had been hours since the horrific discovery was made, and the sun was beginning its descent over the Arizona horizon, casting long shadows across the crime scene. Sheriff Blake Morris was already on edge, feeling the weight of the situation press in on him. Something about the scene felt wrong, off-kilter. There was a strange quiet to the whole thing, a stillness that unnerved him. The first responders had already secured the perimeter, roping off the area with yellow crime scene tape, but Morris could see that they were struggling to make sense of what had happened. It wasn't just the bodies. They had found 5 of them sprawled in various rooms of the cabin, but the lack of answers, the absolute absence of a clear motive, was suffocating. And then there was Hannah, the 12-year-old girl, the lone survivor. When Morris had arrived, he'd been expecting a grisly scene, a chaotic mess of blood and violence. But what he hadn't been prepared for was the eerie calm that had settled over the place. It was as if the horror had been suspended in time, waiting for someone to peel back the layers. The house had been left undisturbed. Furniture was overturned, but there were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. It was like someone had planned it all, meticulously executed the murders, and then just stopped. Stopped. They had found the girl in a corner of the living room, curled up in a fetal position, clutching her knees to her chest. She had been there for hours, seemingly in shock, her face blank, her eyes staring at nothing. When paramedics tried to approach her, she didn't move. They couldn't even get her to say anything, let alone tell them what had happened. They'd given her a blanket, a few sips of water, but the silence remained unbroken. The silence made Morris uneasy. The initial forensic team had been careful, their movements calculated. A few of the officers had taken pictures, cataloging the scene, while others checked for fingerprints or signs of any evidence that might point to a culprit. They didn't find much: no DNA traces, no hidden weapons, no clues that could directly implicate anyone. Only the faintest trace of something, a disturbed patch of dirt near the back door, as if someone had been hiding something. But the significance of it eluded them. Morris had seen murder before, of course. He'd seen the broken bodies, the blood-streaked walls, the senseless violence that tore families apart. But this felt different. Too controlled. Too deliberate. Like whoever had done this was playing a game. And the girl Hannah, she was the key. She was the only person who could explain the madness. The only person who could unravel what had truly happened. But how could someone so young, so innocent, be capable of such brutality? The investigation had started slowly. They'd brought in her family members for questioning, of course. But all they had were questions. No one had any answers. Hannah's mother, who had been unreachable since the incident, was practically in hysterics when the authorities reached her by phone. "My baby. My little girl," she kept repeating, as if in disbelief. Her husband, Mark, had immediately jumped in to try and calm her, but his voice was shaky, unsure. "We don't know anything," he had told the sheriff, standing beside his wife in their small, dimly lit living room. "Hannah, she's not herself. She doesn't understand. She couldn't have." The words trailed off, and Morris could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just concern for the girl anymore. It was fear of what she might have done. Fear of the realization that the child he'd raised could be responsible for the bloodshed. They had no answers from the parents. No one knew where she had gone after the murders. No one could say what had happened after dinner, the last time anyone had seen her before the massacre. The girl had been left alone. No signs of a struggle, no frantic phone calls, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into the desert, leaving only the bodies behind. Detective Carla Sanchez, a seasoned investigator who had worked her share of strange cases, was the first to suggest that maybe this wasn't just a simple family tragedy. The absence of any definitive motive made it clear someone had been hiding something. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. It wasn't random, not in the slightest. The killings were carefully planned, each death occurring in a separate room of the house, each victim caught off guard, each one left to die in their own space. There was no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. Everything pointed to the fact that the killer had been calm, precise. And then, they had just stopped. They had no idea what to make of the way Hannah was acting, though. She wasn't what they had expected from a child who had just witnessed such brutality. There was no sobbing, no frantic attempts to get away. In fact, there was barely any sign that she understood the enormity of what had just happened. When the police first spoke to her, her responses had been eerily blank. "I didn't do it," she had said, her voice soft and hollow, like she was saying the words as much to herself as to them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when she began to talk about it. Not in the way you'd expect a traumatized child to speak, but with a strange, unsettling calm. "There was no way out," she said at one point, her voice almost conversational. "They were all fighting. And I told them. I told them they wouldn't listen. But they didn't hear me. So I made them hear me. I had to." The words sent a cold shiver down the back of Detective Sanchez's spine. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something far darker. And it wasn't just one comment. It was a pattern of disturbing remarks that didn't fit the profile of a scared, innocent child. They tried to get her to explain further, but she just wouldn't say more. She wouldn't engage with anyone except to offer the occasional cryptic comment that only deepened the mystery. Hannah's refusal to break down her utter silence when it came to her family was more unnerving than any of the things she had said. The police questioned her, but each interview felt like a tug of war against a wall that didn't budge. Every response was too measured, too calculated. The eyes of a 12-year-old girl shouldn't have looked so cold, so empty. Yet every time they locked eyes with her, they could see the unsettling void. Days passed, but the questions remained. The investigation seemed to go in circles with no breakthrough. No evidence, no confessions, no nothing. The local authorities brought in experts, psychologists, and forensic specialists who all insisted that Hannah was hiding something, that her behavior was evidence of deeper psychological scars. But no one could figure out what had triggered her behavior. No one could put the pieces together. As the days wore on, and the search for answers intensified, the town itself began to whisper. What had happened to Hannah? What had driven her to do something so horrific? And who was going to pay the price for it? The story of a 12-year-old girl taking down her entire family in a fit of rage was a scandal too much for the quiet town to comprehend. The investigation was far from over, but everyone knew one thing for sure: this was a case that would haunt them for years to come. The truth, whatever it was still out there waiting to be uncovered, lurking in the dark corners of the desert. The aftermath of the massacre left the town in a state of uneasy silence, as if the desert itself had swallowed the truth. The once thriving community now felt like a ghost town, with whispers trailing in every corner, eyes glancing nervously at anyone who dared to speak. The family's cabin, abandoned and cordoned off by authorities, became a chilling monument to the horror that had unfolded. It was an eerie reminder of what had happened, the unspoken terror that still lingered in the air. As the weeks passed, the investigation seemed to stall. Forensic evidence had revealed little. No fingerprints, no blood trails to follow, no indication of anyone else having been involved. Hannah's cold silence persisted. She remained in protective custody, her mind a fortress that refused to yield. Psychiatrists and child psychologists were baffled by her lack of remorse or emotion. They couldn't reach her, couldn't understand the twisted logic behind her actions. It was as though the girl who had once been so full of life had become an entirely different person, someone dangerous and unreachable. The town's residents kept their distance, unable to fathom the darkness that had taken root in such a young girl. The local school held memorial services for the family, but there was an unspoken understanding that the true tragedy had only just begun. What had happened that night would never leave them, the questions echoing in every conversation. Hannah's fate remained uncertain. As her trial approached, leaving the town to reckon with the unspeakable horror and the chilling reality that evil could take root in the most innocent of places. The nightmare was far from over.